Welcome to So Much Fun. I'm Colleen Murphy and I teach sewing. Today I thought we would talk about patch pockets. There are different ways of doing it and you can pick which one you like the best. There's different styles and different techniques. So why don't we get to it? You always want to do your pocket or any embellishments, and I would consider that a pocket is, before you make your garment. It's so much easier to apply a pocket to a garment when the fabric is flat. It's still possible to do when the garment's already made, but it's much, much easier if you do that first. And you'll find in your sewing directions with commercial patterns, that's going to be the first thing they're going to tell you to do after you have your pattern pieces ready for construction. Here is an example of a patch pocket. When I sewed this pocket, I followed the instructions from a commercial pattern. And since that time, I've learned some much simpler ways of doing it, and I want to share those with you today. I'm going to put this aside and show you that your commercial patterns will say to you that you need to fold down the top edge 1 inch and sew 5/8 inch seams. Now what I prefer to do is I prefer to use 3/8 or 1/2 inch seams. I don't see the need to have that much extra, but if you're only using a single layer of fabric, it would be important to have that because you have to fold your edges under, and that extra width will make it easier. However, by only having a single layer of fabric, and you're doing, let's say, a square pocket, you're going to see how inaccurate it can be, and it requires a lot of work to get it so that it's accurate. We're going to flip this over, and with a square pocket, when you get to those corners, you have the choice of either mitering the corner, and you can see how that kind of curves up there, or just folding it up. But when you fold it up, you also have the issue of that fold hanging over to the side, and then you have to be careful as you're sewing to work that over. So these are all problems that you can have if you only have a single layer of fabric to make your pocket. So my suggestion, and is what I always do, is I line the pocket. So I'm using 2 layers of fabric and not 1. Now I've also looked at videos like you have done, no doubt, on how to do patch pockets, and you'll get all kinds of recommendations on what to do. For the lining, my method is different in that I cut it on the bias. So this would be the pattern piece for the outer fabric, which of course means cutting it on the grain line, allowing for that 1 inch top fold. That's fine, I don't have any objection to that. But when you cut your lining piece, you're going to cut it on the bias. You're not cutting it in the same direction. And you're also going to cut it a minimum of 1 inch shorter than the pattern for the outer fabric. And you could even go to 1 1/4 or 1 1/2. But you don't want your lining pattern piece to be the same size as your outer pattern piece. So when you do that, here's an example that's already been sewn together. When you sew that lining to the outer fabric, you start at the top, and I went on in this example and did 5/8 of an inch, but I had to leave an opening. You have to have some way to be able to turn this to the right side. So you sew the top edge first, you leave just enough space, probably 1 1/2 inches, no more than 2 inches, so that you can reach in there to pull it and turn it out. But after you've sewn that top seam, then you want to press that real good, and notice I have pressed it to the lining side, and then I sew the other 3 sides. And in this situation, I only did like a nice 1/4 of an inch seam. Also notice on this one that I did not pivot at the lower corners. Instead, I sewed a seam stopped, cut my thread, and then I began again. And when I crossed over those stitches, I reinforced it. And I did that at both corners. Because you're going to clip those corners off. You're going to trim them off. And if you do your reinforcing at the very edge, you may not get all of that reinforcing there. You might be cutting it off. So I do not pivot. Instead, I sew each side separate, and then when they cross over, I reinforce. So this one has not been trimmed, but this is showing you what you're going to do as far as sewing your seams with your lining and your outer fabric. Now, you have, like I say, lots of options, and it really depends too on the fabric. If your fabric is very dense, like jeans would be, or canvas, doing a double layer of fabric may be too much. So in that case, my lining fabric would be very thin, but I'd still cut it on the bias. So if I were working with denim, I would not have my lining with denim fabric. I would use a lightweight cotton more than likely. But here's another example of taking the same fabric and just doubling the length of it, folding it over, and leaving the opening, which would now be the bottom of the pocket. And then when you turn that, you will, of course, fold that in, and then this will be the top edge of your pocket, and you would just put it on your fabric the same way. If you want to have that 1-inch stitch line, of course you do that before you put the pocket onto the fabric. But this is perfectly acceptable. I think your decisions are really going to be based on your fabric, what kind of fabric you're using for your pocket, as to whether or not you need a different type of fabric for the lining, or if you can use the same fabric for the lining. Now, pockets have different styles, and here's a rounded corner pocket. And this is another example of why using lining makes it so much easier than if you had just a single layer of fabric. If you follow the commercial pattern instructions, they're going to tell you that you would take those rounded corners and you would do a row of stitching around the corner. And I don't see any way possible to be able to get that to be right unless you have a pocket template where you can slide that right in that corner, and then you have to pull your threads and press that down good. And even at that, you're going to get these little points when you do that. But with a single layer of fabric, doing a rounded corner pocket, having a template, something like this, is essential to be able to get those rounded corners. But that's a lot of work, and trying to get both corners to look the same is pretty tricky. So if you have it lined, then you're just, we can look at this again. All you're doing is sewing around, and you've got those rounded corners already cut. So you're just consistent with sewing your seam. But in all of these cases, I no longer do the 5/8 inch seam. I've gone away from that. So here's an example of the rounded corners and how you trim it, of course, but you'll be much more successful, and I think happier with the final product if you use your lining. So here it is on the back where I've already turned it. And you know where that seam is, and we left an opening. I do not bother to hand stitch that together, and I know some people do. I really don't see the need to do that, but if that'll make you happy, go right ahead and do it. Because I know, like if you put that 1-inch stitch line there, you're not going to be able to get anything in there. But it's on the inside, nobody's ever going to see it. But this is what your rounded pocket will look like on the flip side after you have turned it right side out. Now another style of pocket is a pointed corner, and this is what it looks like, all right? And again, this would be very difficult to do with just one layer of fabric. You really do need to use lining with it. I've already done that with this pointed pocket. Here I've sewn the seam. This time I only did a 1/4 inch seam. You know, you have lots of options. I'll say that many times probably, but it really is up to you whether you want to use a 5/8 or you want to use a 1/4 of an inch, use a 1/2 of an inch. But this is the first seam that I sewed, was the lining to the outer fabric. Then I pressed it down. Remember that. You're going to press it down toward the lining side, and then you're ready to sew your side seams. And with this point here, you definitely do not want to pivot. You want to start at the top and sew all the way to the bottom and reinforce at each point. If you try to pivot, more than likely you won't pivot at the exact same spot and you won't have the same distance from point to point. After you finish, you want to trim your corners, trim your fabric to reduce your bulk, and then you'll flip it to the right side, and after you do that, this is what you get. All right? When you get ready to sew it to your garment or whatever your project is, there are a number of things that you can do. You, of course, need to measure to make sure you get it straight, key point. And then you can pin, and when you pin, you want your pins to be perpendicular to your seam line. You want to use an edge foot so that you can sew very, very close to the edge. All right, that would be putting your pins perpendicular to your seam line. Another option, I know someone talked about using basting tape that you would put on the edge underneath. I think glue stick is another way you could go. Just put little dots from the glue stick on the underside of your pocket. Anything to hold it in place so that when you're stitching, it will not move. Here's an example of an edge foot. I mean, if you don't have an edge foot, you can still do it, but the edge foot just makes it so much easier because you just put the edge of your pocket right next to the edge of the foot and adjust your needle position so that you're sewing like 1/8 of an inch from the very edge of the pocket. And at the top of the pocket, it's extremely important that you give that extra reinforcement. You either do a double or triple back stitch on that. Some pockets will have a little triangle to add extra strength, but you definitely don't just do one reverse at the top of each side of the pocket. You want to do more than one. It's got to have extra reinforcement. Using the edge foot, I highly recommend because it's much more accurate and much easier and for you to be consistent with your stitching. I hope this video has been helpful for you, and when you are making your patch pockets, you know that you have lots of options on how you want to do it. Please like and subscribe and have so much fun.